At dawn on January 28, 1944, the slopes of Monte Cassino were wrapped in a heavy mist that muffled sound and cloaked movement. To most soldiers of the U.S. 34th Infantry Division, the mountain looked less like a battlefield and more like a waiting tomb. Few people today know that before the famous assaults on the abbey itself, a small platoon from the division was sent on what appeared to be a minor reconnaissance operation. It was routine, almost forgettable. Yet this platoon would never be seen again. Their disappearance remains one of the most puzzling incidents of the Italian campaign. The men belonged to Company E of the 168th Infantry Regiment, veterans of North Africa. They had climbed cold hills before, fought through dense terrain before, and lost friends before. But Monte Cassino was different. This was no mere objective. It was a natural fortress, held by some of the most experienced German paratroopers, the 1st Volkschirmjäger Division. Every ridge and ruined farmhouse was watched. Every valley was measured for artillery range. For soldiers on the ground, it felt like the Germans knew your position moments before you did. Tactical maps at Allied headquarters labeled a sector west of Sant'Angelo as quiet. But veterans knew there was no such thing as a quiet zone near Cassino. A report by Major Charles Wilson, dated January 30th, warned, visibility 0 in sections. Enemy patrols suspected. Movement beyond Route 6 should be limited. Yet on February 1st, a reconnaissance platoon of roughly 25 men was selected to move beyond that very route. Their objective: identify possible artillery nests and check rail lines believed to be used for German supply. They left before noon. A final radio message was recorded, moving to check position, crossing low ground now. That was the last transmission officially tied to them. The challenge of operating in this area cannot be overstated. The hills near Sant'Angelo were a maze of ravines, orchards, stone walls, and abandoned farmhouses. Winter rain turned paths into mud that swallowed boots. Artillery strikes fell randomly, sometimes miles off target, sometimes terrifyingly accurate. Civilians had mostly fled, leaving ghost settlements as cover for either side. Some GIs kept diary notes describing the area as hollow ground where even the wind feels watched. Despite this, the platoon moved swiftly and professionally. They were equipped with M1 Garand, Thompson submachine guns, and a single SCR-300 radio. 2 men carried binoculars. One was a staff sergeant named Leonard Hughes, known for keeping calm when others could not. A private in his unit later wrote of him, "Hughes could stare into fog and still see steady ground. He made men certain when maps didn't." What happened after they crossed the low ground remains the central mystery. Weather conditions worsened. The fog thickened into a wall of pale gray. No German attack was reported in that sector during those hours. No artillery barrage was recorded. Yet not one man from the platoon returned. Not one sign of a firefight was found. The following morning, a second unit was dispatched to locate them. But visibility was almost zero beyond 100 meters. A corporal reported seeing dark figures moving on a ridge, but they disappeared into the mist before identification. When he was asked if they might have been friendly forces, he replied, "They moved too carefully. It felt like they were watching us." By that evening, the search was called off. The offensive against Monte Cassino was intensifying. Higher commands no longer had time or manpower to spare. There were no dog tags discovered. No helmets. No weapons left behind. No blood trails. Official logs mention the platoon only as forward element, unreturned, status unconfirmed. But some historians believe the decision to send them may have been controversial from the start. The location they entered bordered known German lines more closely than previously acknowledged. There are hints of confusion in the orders that day, suggesting the platoon may have been sent into danger based on flawed intelligence. A modern analysis of terrain shows that slight map miscalculations could have placed them directly in the path of German defenses. If they had been mistaken for an enemy unit by Allied spotters, or even by friendly artillery, there would have been little chance for survival. But even then, there should have been evidence. The absence of any trace raises more questions than answers. Perhaps the most haunting observation came from a chaplain of the division, who wrote after hearing of the disappearance, "Sometimes men do not die in front of us, they fade behind us. And the mountain keeps them." It would be easy to dismiss this as poetic grief. But the silence surrounding the platoon's fate was unusual, even for war. The recon team from Company E stepped across a field on a foggy February afternoon. They followed orders. They followed procedure. And then they were gone. No record explains why. And no record mentions where they went next. Their mission had just begun. And their silence had only started to unfold. In the early hours of February 12, 1944, the fog over the Leary Valley settled like a curtain drawn by unseen hands. Allied momentum was building, but the terrain remained unforgiving, with deep gullies, stone farmhouses, and silent roads that could conceal entire movements. It was on this morning that the missing platoon from the 34th Infantry Division was officially marked operationally detached. Their task was straightforward: advance toward the outskirts of Sant'Angelo and identify enemy artillery positions suspected of targeting Route 6. According to battle logs, they confirmed their starting position. But what followed was never fully documented. The platoon's advance was based on hastily updated intelligence maps suggesting a weak spot along the German defensive line. The area was believed to be sparsely occupied, possibly held by scattered sentries from the 1st Volkssturmger Division. Staff Sergeant Leonard Hughes, leading the recon element, radioed once, "Crossed field. Will establish lookout at ridge. Low contact probability." This message, recorded at 10:47 a.m., was the last verified transmission from the platoon. The struggle began almost immediately. Thick undergrowth and recent rainfall made navigation slow. The platoon moved in single-file formations, with scouts checking every ruined outbuilding for signs of German presence. Some walls still bore bullet marks from previous engagements, traces of close-quarter fighting that had occurred weeks earlier. Yet there were no enemy bodies. No spent casings. Just cold stones and empty windows. One soldier noted privately, "The ground feels used, but not lived in." Nearby, other Allied units reported scattered firefights along the Gustav Line. Yet none mentioned engagements in the sector where the recon platoon vanished. The silence was unusual. German records from the same period, later reviewed by historians, showed no engagements reported in that sector at all. In fact, several German positions were pulled back to the higher ground that week, leaving the lower valley temporarily unguarded. Or so it seemed. The insight that complicated matters came from radio intelligence. Allied intercept units at the time were monitoring shortwave transmissions believed to come from German artillery observers near Monte Cassino. On February 13, a transmission was intercepted, but never decoded, just minutes after the U.S. platoon's final radio message. The entry in the intercept log reads only, "Unidentified signal. Strength moderate. Frequency unusual." Historians still do not know whether this signal had any connection to the platoon, but it marked the last radio activity in their sector before the airwaves went silent. Several theories emerged among officers searching for explanations. Some believed the platoon fell victim to German snipers lying in wait. Others speculated they were swallowed by the fog, advancing too far into enemy lines without realizing it. A small chance exists that friendly artillery, hoping to sever German supply routes, fired upon them after mistaking their movements for German withdrawal. A statement found in a later investigation reads, "No indication of fratricide, though visibility rendered certainty impossible." What no one could explain was the total absence of evidence. A tactical withdrawal would have left traces: footprints, discarded gear, ammunition boxes. A firefight would have left shell casings, craters, smoke. But search parties found nothing, not even a scrap of uniform cloth along the ridge the platoon was expected to reach. It was as if the field had been swept clean, as if no soldiers had walked there at all. To add to the confusion, a British artillery observer positioned 2 kilometers away claimed to have seen movement along the ridgeline just hours after the platoon was dispatched. He remembered shapes, glints of metal, and the faint outline of men, but he could not tell if they were Americans or German paratroopers. His final remark in his field journal read, "They did not move like men who knew where they were going. They turned as though they were being watched." This observation, though vague, fed into a growing mystery. If the platoon had been ambushed, why was no attack recorded on either side? If they had been captured, why was there no German record of prisoners? And if they had been mistakenly shelled, why were no remains found? Only uninterrupted mud and an unnaturally quiet stretch of land? Modern military analysts looking back at the case often conclude that the simplest answer is miscommunication. Perhaps the platoon went too far. Perhaps they encountered an enemy patrol at precisely the wrong moment. Perhaps they died unseen. Yet others are less certain. One historian studying the division logs remarked, "Declarations of loss are rarely this silent. When men die, there is a trail. Here, there is only a gap." The disappearance of the platoon during that fog-laden reconnaissance mission marked the beginning of a silence that would only deepen in the days ahead. What started as an ordinary assignment soon became an unspoken mystery. And officially, the platoon never reached its objective. But someone, or something, was watching them. And the valley kept its secrets. On February 15, 1944, as the Battle of Monte Cassino intensified, Allied forces believed the missing platoon might still be alive somewhere behind enemy lines. Hope lingered because no signs of combat were found, and no remains had surfaced. Command assumed silence meant they were trapped, or perhaps holding position in radio blackout. Yet the urgency of the coming assault rapidly overshadowed any focused search effort. Strategic priorities changed, and the missing men slowly slipped from active concern into the background, just as the archives would later show. It was around this time that disturbing clues began to emerge. Intelligence units flagged the sudden movement of German paratrooper detachments in the same sector where the platoon disappeared. Units belonging to the 1st Volkschirmjäger Division were reportedly regrouping around Hill 593, a brutally contested high point overlooking the valley. Originally, this repositioning was dismissed as routine defensive maneuvering. But one British liaison officer noted that timing of enemy movement aligns too closely with loss of American contact. It was an observation few paid attention to. As artillery roared across the valley, stories began circulating among the troops. Some claimed they heard sporadic gunfire in the fog the night after the platoon vanished. One corporal recalled hearing what sounded like muffled shouts, maybe English, maybe not, followed by silence. The accounts were vague and inconsistent, yet they hinted at a possibility few dared to speak aloud. The platoon may have been ambushed, captured, or worse, executed. Still, German records recovered after the war made no mention of American prisoners found in that sector during those days. The struggle to find answers grew more complex as the front changed daily. Search parties attempted limited patrols, but shifting German defenses and worsening weather forced withdrawals. A captain in command of one such search effort wrote in his notes on February 18, 3 hours spent navigating fog. No signs of conflict. No tracks. Ground feels erased. One line of his report was later underlined by military investigators, as though no men ever walked it. Despite this, something was undeniably happening in the hills. Allied intelligence detected German radio activity in short bursts, believed to be encrypted artillery coordination. Analysts attempted to decode one of these transmissions but failed. One American operator swore he heard an English phrase behind the static, "Send help," though the recording was too unclear to verify. The claim was dismissed, yet it never fully went away. The operator's simple remark, "It sounded like one of ours," remains written in the margin of his log. Context matters. Monte Cassino was not just a battle. It was a layered conflict of terrain, weather, miscommunication, and desperation. Each side operated in shifting conditions that defied clarity. Civilians were nearly absent. Landmarks were destroyed. Troops advanced based on rumors, maps drawn from memory, and orders issued under unimaginable pressure. In such an environment, entire units could lose their bearings, or disappear entirely. Still, there was no finding that convincingly explained the absence of physical evidence. That, more than anything, kept suspicion alive. One quiet revelation came from an unusual source, a monk from the nearby Benedictine monastery. Before fleeing the abbey, he had walked the lower slopes to collect relics for safekeeping. Weeks later, interviewed by Allied forces, he said this of his journey: "I felt watched in the woods, not as prey but as if someone feared being seen." The comment struck some as the words of a frightened civilian, but others saw it as strangely aligned with what the troops had felt. Not hunted. Observed. Modern military analysts disagree on the likely outcome. Some believe the platoon was caught in the reformation of the German defensive line and swiftly eliminated. Others argue they were taken prisoner, but perhaps mistaken for spies, deprived of documentation, and killed without record. A final theory suggests an Allied artillery miscalculation erased them entirely. Yet one truth remains: no shell craters matching time or location were ever confirmed. The land offered no answers. For investigators after the war, this absence of evidence posed a serious problem. How can there be no remains, no equipment, no trace of uniforms anywhere? Why was the platoon's last known position revised multiple times in official documents? And why do some radio logs appear to have been removed, or never written at all? One intelligence officer wrote years later, "Our war was fought on many fronts, some against the enemy, others against silence." His comment reflects a deeper truth about Monte Cassino. Losses were expected, but mysteries were not. And this platoon, by all conventional logic, should never have disappeared so completely. By late February, Allied command made a decision that would alter the course of the narrative. The platoon was no longer missing. They were presumed dead in the line of duty. But no one could say where. No one could say how. And no one, not even the records, could explain why the land had erased them so thoroughly. The war moved on. The offensive pushed forward. But the silence stayed behind, waiting in the valleys for someone to return. By February 20, 1944, the Allied push toward Monte Cassino had become a full-scale operation, with British, Polish, and American forces converging on the Gustav Line. Amid the chaos, the missing U.S. platoon from Company E of the 168th Infantry Regiment faded from operational priority. Reports of their last sighting were reduced to a single line in the divisional logs: forward element, unreturned. Status unconfirmed. No further orders referenced their mission, and the men were effectively erased from the official narrative, a silence that would grow heavier with each passing day. The struggle to comprehend the disappearance was compounded by the intensity of the battle. Monte Cassino itself became a focal point of bombardment and infantry assaults. Artillery fire from both sides turned the valley into a cratered wasteland. Communication lines were frequently severed, and miscoordination was common. Field officers later admitted that in such conditions, small units could vanish without a trace. Yet even by those standards, the lack of any evidence regarding the platoon was extraordinary. No bodies, no weapons, no personal effects, nothing, had been recovered despite repeated patrols. Insight into the operational environment came from diaries and after-action reports. One lieutenant wrote, "The fog, the rain, and the shell fire, these conspire to make men disappear without sound or witness." The missing platoon's route had been along lower ridges near Sant'Angelo, areas that were technically behind German forward defenses but still within range of Allied artillery and snipers. For soldiers navigating these treacherous slopes, every step carried the risk of sudden death or capture. Yet the platoon's disappearance left no trace, suggesting that whatever befell them occurred in near-complete isolation, or under circumstances that were never documented. The reveal of missing communications added another layer of mystery. Radio logs maintained at division headquarters showed the last transmission from the platoon, but follow-up messages expected from command were either absent or mysteriously redacted. In some sections of the archival record, typed orders were found with entire lines scratched out. Modern historians reviewing these documents note the unusual gaps. For a platoon to vanish with no records of engagement or interception is almost unheard of. This absence is striking because the 34th Infantry Division was otherwise meticulous in recording movements and casualties. Adding to the intrigue, anecdotal reports from nearby units suggested that sporadic movement had been observed along the ridges where the platoon was expected. One sergeant noted in his field notebook that shadows appeared to move against the fog, yet when troops investigated, nothing remained. Civilians who had returned to nearby villages later recounted hearing what sounded like muffled voices and occasional bursts of gunfire during the same period. However, no bodies or equipment were ever discovered in these areas. The plausibility of friendly fire, enemy ambush, or capture seemed increasingly murky, leaving the disappearance in an almost unexplainable limbo. The application of historical context helps illuminate why the missing platoon's fate remained unresolved. The Italian campaign was a complex theater, with multinational coordination, uneven intelligence, and harsh terrain. Forward units frequently operated with minimal support, relying on radio signals and visual reconnaissance. Under these conditions, small detachments could find themselves isolated, exposed to both the enemy and the chaos of their own artillery fire. Still, the extraordinary lack of evidence, no remains, no equipment, no confirmed sightings, suggests that something beyond the typical fog of war occurred. Whether this was due to a miscalculation, a fleeting enemy encounter, or other unknown factors is impossible to verify conclusively. The closing observation of this phase comes from a surviving officer who later recounted the division's reaction. "We kept moving forward because the battle demanded it, but every man knew that something terrible had befallen that platoon. Yet no one could speak of it officially. It was as if the mountain itself had swallowed them whole." This chilling perspective captures the combination of operational necessity and unresolvable mystery that define the missing platoon's story. As February drew to a close, the Allied forces concentrated on the Abbey and the higher ridges surrounding Monte Cassino. Tactical priorities overshadowed the reconnaissance mission, and the valley's quiet, where the platoon had last been seen, was left largely unexplored. The men who vanished became a footnote in reports, a line in the ledger, a silence no record could explain. And yet, somewhere in those fog-laden slopes and craggy ridges, unanswered questions lingered. The missing platoon had vanished into a landscape of war, weather, and uncertainty, a mystery that would haunt historians and families alike for decades. The search for answers was far from over, and the next chapter of this story would reveal even more disturbing contradictions and elusive clues. By early March 1944, the Battle of Monte Cassino had escalated into one of the most grueling campaigns of the Italian front. Artillery shells fell in continuous arcs, and the once quiet valleys became a maelstrom of destruction. Amid this chaos, rumors about the missing platoon intensified. Soldiers whispered of an entire detachment, swallowed by the fog, a phrase that captured both literal and metaphorical meaning. Some believed the platoon had been caught in crossfire between German positions and Allied artillery, while others feared they had been captured and executed as spies, yet no German record supported either scenario. The struggle to reconcile these possibilities highlighted the harsh realities of wartime intelligence. Allied officers, reviewing operational maps and aerial reconnaissance, could locate German machine gun nests and mortar positions, but the area where the platoon disappeared showed no evidence of engagement. Even the terrain itself, the dense olive groves, orchards, and labyrinth of ruined buildings, offered few clues. A corporal from a nearby unit recorded in his field notebook, "The hills swallow sound and men alike. One can be certain of nothing." In other words, the land itself conspired against clarity. The insight gained from examining German archives was equally perplexing. Post-war reports revealed that the 1st Volkssturmger Division had no record of prisoners or engagements matching the platoon's disappearance. Their patrols and defensive positions had been meticulously documented, yet there was no mention of any confrontation with U.S. troops in the suspected area. Military historians reviewing the data concluded that the platoon's loss could not be explained by conventional combat alone. The anomaly deepened. A full platoon, properly equipped, had vanished without leaving traceable evidence of battle, capture, or death. Further revelations came from soldier accounts in the weeks following the disappearance. One British artillery observer reported glimpsing figures along the ridgeline at dawn, shapes that moved deliberately, but strangely, as if avoiding direct observation. Attempts to investigate were abandoned due to incoming fire and worsening weather. Yet the observer's testimony added fuel to the idea that the platoon's final movements were witnessed by someone, or something. It was a tantalizing but incomplete fragment, a shadow of truth embedded in uncertainty. Application of historical perspective shows that such disappearances, while rare, were not entirely impossible during the Italian campaign. Small units often operated isolated from the main line, navigating unfamiliar terrain, facing miscommunication, and contending with the unpredictable chaos of war. Yet the total absence of material evidence, dog tags, weapons, or any indication of conflict, remains extraordinary. In most comparable situations, even a miscalculated retreat would leave a trail. Here, there was nothing. The land had effectively erased them. The reveal of these contradictions forced military investigators to confront an unsettling possibility. Official records and field reports were incomplete, intentionally or not. Some lines of inquiry were closed with a terse notation, "No further information available." Families of the missing men received similarly vague notices, citing "killed in action," circumstances unknown. Letters sent to division headquarters were met with bureaucratic deflection, reinforcing the sense of finality, yet leaving the story unresolved. By mid-March, as the battle raged on surrounding Monte Cassino, the missing platoon became more than a tactical footnote. They became a symbol of the uncertainties of war. Soldiers on the front lines spoke of them in hushed tones, as if acknowledging the inexplicable. A chaplain recorded in his journal, "Some losses are counted, some are mourned, but few are understood. This platoon belongs to that last category." The sense of collective unease underscored a psychological truth. Not all wartime disappearances are explained by the enemy. Sometimes they are swallowed by circumstance, oversight, or the sheer chaos of conflict. The tension culminates as the Allied offensive toward Monte Cassino continued, and strategic priorities left little room for a dedicated search. The platoon's fate remained suspended in uncertainty. Soldiers moved on, yet the mountain and valley seemed to retain the memory of those men. Their disappearance left a void not only in the unit but in the historical record, a silence that echoed louder than any battlefield noise. And so the missing platoon became a ghost story of Monte Cassino, a real, unsolved mystery. No official account clarified whether they had been ambushed, captured, or inadvertently shelled. Only the mountains knew the truth, and they remained tight-lipped. The story of Monte Cassino would continue, and with it, the quest to uncover what truly happened to the men who vanished without a trace. By late March 1944, the Allied offensive at Monte Cassino had reached a fever pitch. The combined forces of the US 34th Infantry Division, the British 8th Army, and Polish units were pressing forward under relentless artillery barrages and continuous air strikes. Amid this monumental effort, the missing platoon from Company E remained an unresolved enigma. Division headquarters had officially declared them killed in the line of duty, yet there was no documentation of combat, no body recovered, and no trace of personal equipment. The silence surrounding their fate became a question mark in the historical record, one that would intrigue military analysts and historians for decades. Investigators after the war scoured operational archives, radio logs, and division reports. Some documents were missing entirely. Others had redacted passages where the platoon's movements had once been recorded. Interviews with surviving soldiers revealed sporadic, contradictory recollections. One veteran recalled seeing faint movement along the ridgeline on the morning of February 12, while another claimed he heard gunfire from an isolated valley. Yet no combination of testimonies produced a definitive explanation. Even German archives provided no clarity. The 1st Fallschirmjäger Division had no record of engaging US forces in that particular sector at the critical time. The human dimension of this mystery is compelling. Families received only brief, bureaucratic letters stating that their loved ones were missing, presumed dead. Soldiers in other units spoke of the platoon in whispers, reluctant to dwell on the uncertainty. The lack of closure left a psychological scar on those who fought at Monte Cassino, fostering a lingering tension that outlasted the battle itself. One chaplain's note captures this sentiment. "Some men vanish not into death, but into the silence left behind. Modern military historians analyzing the terrain and operational reports propose several possibilities. Perhaps the platoon was caught in a rare combination of circumstances, disoriented by fog, separated from the main unit, and inadvertently swept away by either friendly or enemy fire. Perhaps they were captured and killed in a skirmish that went unrecorded. Or perhaps, most unervingly, a lapse in record-keeping, compounded by the fog of war and the chaos of the Allied offensive, simply erased them from history. Each hypothesis, however, lacks concrete evidence, leaving the disappearance officially unresolved. One of the most perplexing aspects is the total absence of material evidence. In comparable engagements, even units annihilated under fire leave behind uniforms, weapons, or at least fragments of equipment. In this case, nothing. No helmets, no ammunition casings, not a single dog tag. Reconnaissance reports submitted days later noted only empty fields, mud-slicked slopes, and the lingering silence of an area where an entire platoon had once moved with purpose. It is as if the mountain itself had absorbed their presence and left no trace behind. The story's close is not an answer, but a reflection. Monte Cassino was a campaign defined by immense courage, staggering losses, and extraordinary tactical complexity. The missing platoon serves as a reminder that even in meticulously documented operations, war holds space for mystery, for unexplained absence, and for questions that survive long after the last shell has fallen. As historian Major Richard T. Mills once wrote, "Some soldiers are counted, some mourned, but some remain as echoes in the landscape, their story never fully told." Decades later, military historians, documentary filmmakers, and families continue to grapple with the same question. What truly happened to the men who vanished at Monte Cassino? They left no final report, no farewell, and no battlefield relics. Yet their story endures, preserved in the fog, the ridges, and the valleys of Italy, a silence no record explains, and a mystery that endures to this day. The missing platoon did not die in conventional ways, nor did they vanish into myth. They disappeared into the harsh, unyielding reality of Monte Cassino, a stark reminder that the human cost of war often defies documentation. Their fate remains an open question, suspended in the shadows of history, awaiting the unlikely revelation that may someday explain a silence that has lasted more than 70 years.